Before I get to Melanie, I just wanted to comment on something that Teresa said, and it was about, she was talking, of course, about the Rita Hall Foundation and contributing in so many different ways, including civic life. So I'm going to give a plug for civic life because I've been a counselor for 1 year. I don't know why, well, I'm going to tell you why I ran. So, because I'm going to inspire you to step forward. 3 years, just municipal elections again. Sorry, Nancy. So after a career of about 27 years as a lawyer on Bay Street, I had to step down. I had some health issues at the time. So my husband and I eventually made our way up here and participating in the community as a volunteer in the arts community. And then I looked around and I thought my training and expertise as a lawyer in the sector I practice in, which was municipal law and development, I thought I could help. Really, I thought I could help. So, because you don't do it for the money. So anyway, so I stepped forward. Surprisingly, I was elected. And I just wanted to say, as part of the inspiration for why you should think about this, is what surprised me is the number of people who have stepped forward and contacted me, knowing I was really just there to help. Everyone from the person who ran the Toronto Region Conservation Authority for a couple of decades and now living in this community, to a woman developer. One of the few women developers in Canada approached me a couple of months ago. They have a place in the town of Blue Mountains. She wanted to donate $500,000 for trees for Collingwood. Right? It's things like that, and there was a woman who's I met. She came to council one day, introduced herself. She's an architect, and she said, I want to give books. I want to give a book to every councillor around how to build a better community. So just say, there's some inspiration at all levels, and I just encourage you to get involved. Okay, so why am I here? To introduce Melanie Rodriguez. Melanie is a passionate leader in the nonprofit sector. And although she's a local girl hailing from Thornbury, for a decade she worked with over 20 nonprofits in North America, Central America, and South America. She has worked in a variety of roles, from delivering postgraduate sustainability curriculums to managing business development as an executive director in an international children's foundation, to evaluating volunteer programs in rural Nicaragua. This year, 2019, Melanie has been leading advocacy as the head delegate for Canada at the G7 Youth Summit this year. Now, the Youth Summit is comprised of youth delegates from the G7 countries, the EU and the African Union, and they work together to create recommendations to give to the G7 heads of state and government. So just to say again, Melanie was the head Canadian youth delegate. And she's here. So what is Melanie doing right now? Her daytime job, she's managing communications and network engagement for the Ontario Nonprofit Network. And in her spare time, she's completing her MBA at the Schulich School of Business. I'm pleased to introduce Melanie Rodriguez.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Nancy, for having me here today. It's so great to be back in my hometown and to be able to hear about all the amazing charities and all the amazing philanthropic work that's being done here. As was mentioned, I've worked with about 20 nonprofits just over in the past 10 years since graduating high school in Meaford, for any of you who are from there. Woo-hoo, Meaford! And I've had so many incredible opportunities with the nonprofit sector, but I didn't always want to work in nonprofits. If you asked me 10 years ago when I was in high school, I probably would have said that I'd be in a traditional career like law or accounting. But in 2012, my life changed forever. Because in 2012, I decided to use my savings and my OSAP loan to go volunteer abroad. And I ended up in Peru at El Arca Children's Home. El Arca Children's Home is a home for children who come from backgrounds of abuse, of neglect, of abandonment, or who are orphaned. And although the backgrounds of these children are really, really sad and sometimes are really hard pills to swallow when you hear the full story, the children themselves are the complete opposite. They are filled with overwhelming compassion, with joy, and with this dedication to help others. They are, my role models till this day, even though they're obviously younger than me, and I cannot believe how incredible each one of the children who has grown up there is. So once I came to this home, I knew my life was changed forever and that my life purpose was always going to be to help children like them get access to the privileges and opportunities that frankly I had taken for granted every single day. And although I knew what my new life goal was, I had zero idea on how I was going to work towards it. And I'm still, kind of figuring it out. But I knew I needed to start somewhere and start developing some new skill sets in order to create the change that I really wanted to see in the world. And so I started by finishing my degree at Ivy Business School, where I worked 3 jobs, had access to amazing volunteer opportunities, and was able to graduate at the top of my class. And this kind of helped me line up some jobs that would further develop my financial analysis skill set and communications, which I thought were going to be really important moving forward. So I did everything from evaluating the risk of a $200 million loan portfolio for TD to then running a children's foundation that implemented education projects in Peru and Bolivia. And although, the lessons I've learned throughout these jobs have been amazing, I find that the greatest lessons that I've learned have actually came through my volunteering. So I thought today I'd share 3 of the lessons I've learned, and hopefully they can help you guys when you're thinking about how you want to dedicate your own philanthropic efforts. So the first lesson I learned is that sometimes it's more important to focus on empowerment than happiness. And so although none of you would probably be against empowering others, going against your natural instincts sometimes is to try to make people happy. So for example, when I started volunteering at El Arca Children's Home, as a broke student, I didn't have much to give, but I knew it was the absolute best feeling ever when I could make one of the kids smile. And so year after year, when I would go back to the home, I would start, saving up all my tip money to have these customized gifts. So it would be their favorite color, their favorite animal. Maybe if they really liked art, it would be, art supplies. And there was no better feeling than seeing how happy it would make the kids. But the problem is that when I left and I would fly back home every single time, I didn't address the real problem, which is the fact that the home at the time was really struggling to make ends meet. They didn't know how they were going to pay for food or how they were going to afford to help more kids, even though there was always more kids who needed help that they could help. And so this past year, when I was on maternity leave, I decided that rather than, dedicating money or gifts that would surely make the kids happy, I needed to focus on something that would make the orphanage itself sustainable. And so I worked with Rotary clubs across Ontario, talked about the great work that El Arca was doing, and we implemented a solar system that would save them $500 a month on their operating expenses. Thank you. So, a solar system isn't going to be very exciting for the kids, and they're probably not going to understand what a solar-powered fridge is going to make a difference for them. But now the parents of the home have the opportunity to choose that $500 to go towards school supplies, medicine, or helping more kids, whatever they need at the time. The second lesson that I learned was that it's really important to engage all the different pillars of society. So the for-profit sector, the not-for-profit sector, or the government. So how many people here have worked in the private sector or the for-profit sector? Great. How many people here have worked in the nonprofit sector? Amazing. And how many people here have worked with government? Oh, this is an awesome crowd. So this is a perfect example of how important it is to engage all the different pillars of society. And so for me, a really great example when I think about this is early childhood education. So when I'm saying early childhood, I'm talking about daycare, before you start primary school. Early childhood education is one of the very, very few proven solutions to reduce inequality so drastically, more than any other form of education. On top of this, studies that have been done, over 4 decades in Canada, the US, in Europe, have all proven that it's not only beneficial, from the social aspect, but it actually saves countries money in the long term. So it's a really good return on investment. Yet despite this, most children don't have access to quality daycare. And so for me, this is a great example of how we really need all the pillars to come together, because we see for-profit companies coming up with great solutions. They're putting daycares in their actual buildings, their offices, or providing flex time for parents to really help. We also see not-for-profits providing so many different services to help people who don't have the income for daycare. But the thing that we're kind of missing that's really important is the government. And although we've kind of moved the needle a bit, there's still a long way to go to make sure that everyone has access to early childhood education. And so that's why this year I decided to join the Y7 Summit and advocate for early childhood education, not just with the international delegates, but also with the G7 leaders and with ambassadors around the world. So that way, hopefully, 20 years from now, when someone's doing a talk like this, everyone in Canada and in the G7 countries, and eventually, the whole world will have access to early childhood education. So the last lesson that I want to share with you guys today is maybe one that you can relate to, depending on how your career took you, and it has to do with burnout. So one of my first careers in international development was working in Nicaragua. And I would work with an international charity that kind of combined volunteerism, public health, and microfinance, and a bunch of other areas to have this holistic approach to really build communities and make them escape the cycle of poverty. One of the first community visits I had, I was interviewing families in Spanish. And to kind of give you a little bit of context, these families were in the level of extreme poverty. So the families either lived in homes that were made of clay bricks, they lived under tarps, or they lived in, what we wouldn't call a house, but for them were houses. And time again, these families would keep telling me that their greatest hope and dream was that their child could have access to education. And in this one house in particular, I remember talking to the mom, and her daughter, who is, up to here on me, was so petite, so small, and just so full of innocence. And she told me again that her greatest hope and dream was that her daughter would have access to education, and that she really wanted her to be able to learn how to read and to do all these things that she couldn't. And then as she looked at her daughter, she said, she's done school. And it was so hard for me to understand how someone that small could be done school because they didn't have access to education past grade 3 in the community. And so you can imagine, as anyone would in this situation, I was so motivated and I really wanted to help. And since I didn't have, money or something significant to contribute at the time, I wanted to dedicate my time. And so I worked, every hour I could, 8 a.m. to 11 p.m., 7 days a week. And when I would have spare time, I would make meals with my Spanish teacher, and we would deliver them to the basurero, which is the Spanish word for like a junkyard, where you would just have miles and miles of trash that were burning, because that was their way of getting rid of the trash. And there would be families and children as young as, 4 years old going through the trash to try to find something that they could sell. And so some of you may be able to see maybe where the story is going is that working that many hours is kind of a recipe for burnout. And what ended up happening was I got, every parasite you could probably get and didn't take the time to go to the doctor. So I ended up having to leave just after 6 months of being there. And I was so devastated because it wasn't just that I failed myself, but I had failed my organization, and most importantly, I had failed that community that I really promised that I was going to give everything I could. And so as I came back to Canada, and I was really thinking about, what do I want to do as my next step to try to help, I started getting these emails from volunteers that I'd worked with and that I'd done presentations with on the importance of volunteering, not only when you're abroad, but making sure you're supporting and volunteering when you come back home. And I started getting these emails about how people were starting to volunteer in their local communities, and they were trying to develop new sustainable solutions to combat poverty. And that's when it really hit me, the greatest lesson that I've probably ever learned. And that is, alone, our impact is limited. We only have so much money, so much time, and so much energy before we burn out. But if we can inspire just one other person to make an impact in our community, that's when we really start the snowball effect of making change. And that's when we really see that our impact can become infinite. So as you're continuing the day and you're meeting with amazing women in the community, I hope you remember 3 things. One, to always try to focus on empowerment if you can with your philanthropic efforts. Our focus shouldn't be to keep people dependent on aid, but instead, how can we help organizations and communities thrive and be able to become independent of aid? The second thing is use your success in whatever sector you were in to come to events like this and to work together with all the different pillars of society, because that's when we're really going to see systemic change. It's not going to just change, short-term impact, but that's where we're going to see the change that affects and outlives, our own lives. And the last one is always focus on collaboration, because alone our impact is limited, but together when we come to events like this and we're a collective of strong, powerful women, that's when we can make our impact infinite. Thank you.
Now, how great is she? How amazing. And you know how I located Melanie was through the review. You know, the Thornberry Review that comes in your mailbox? There was an article about everything she'd done. I went, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. So I reached out to her, and people kind of go, well, and you are? Like, tell me who you're a bit of a stalker, I think. Anyway, as we've worked together, she really is a true champion of championing other women. Like, she's working for a lot. She sees what I'm working, and it's like, how can we work together? And no fear, which is so, so, so appreciated. She has an 18-month-old as well, in case you didn't know. Now, one person that I want to celebrate is the proud mom. Could the proud mom please stand? Because that's good, really, really, really good for you. Congratulations, really good. And now we've recruited, I always have a little bit of strategy behind everything I do. I wanted Yvonne to introduce her because Yvonne is leading a youth advisory council that's just in formation. And Melanie is so great. She wants this community to be a role model for Canada in terms of all sorts of possibilities. So we've got a little gem, we've got a leader, and again, we've got lots of opportunities for you to get involved if you'd like to. Okay, I now want to turn it over to Ron, Nicola Wealth, and he's going to give us a transformational philanthropy presentation. And again, Ron, thank you so much for being a lead sponsor, and you can see how philanthropy is coming alive in Southern Georgian Bay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your busy weekends with your families, with your endeavors to be here. Philanthropy is really near and dear to my personal heart for many reasons. It's not lost on me that I am in a sea of women here today. Last night we were having dinner, and I had mentioned there was I think a quote by Bono who said the world needs more Canada, and I had said the world needs more Canadian women, is my thought. I'm happy to report that I am doing my part. I have 3 daughters, and I do have a token son as well, yes. Our firm, maybe what I want to get out of today really is, I think the word you used that really resonated just now is empower. I want to empower all of you to think about philanthropy differently. Whether you're coming at it from a personal perspective or an industry professional, in the philanthropic space, to start challenging your donors or potential donors, the community, to think about philanthropy a little bit differently. And so what I'm going to go through today is a few cases that we have used with our clients in terms of transforming their wishes, even if it's on a tight budget, into significant philanthropic opportunities for things that are near and dear to them. After I'm done, Mira will come up and give the legal part of it, and then together we'll take some questions from the audience at that point. So a little bit about philanthropy, and we're going to end today with what this gentleman has to do with philanthropy. And I think most of you know this is John Lennon, great poet, singer, songwriter, died far too young. But let's put a pin in that at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to see what he has to do with philanthropy. A little bit about our organization. We have been around over 25 years, national team of advisors throughout Canada. I lead the Ontario growth. We do have in our firm over 60% of the firm is women, and it's the same on our senior leadership team. We have seen tremendous growth in our organization and success as a result of having the diversity. And I would tell you that our average age is probably 40 in our organization. We're a very young organization, very philanthropic minded. And that explains, and I have to apologize for the scruff. I think many of you, if you have spouses or you have partners or sons, you know that it's Movember, and so it gives us an excuse to not shave for a month, so I apologize for that. And if you're so inclined to follow me on LinkedIn after today, you'll see the progression of this over the month. One thing I will be doing, a little plug here, is if I reach my target of $18,018.18, I will provide the shears to the top donor to shave my hair completely. So there's a lot of hair here, and in about a month, it'll be like out to there. So that's what I'll do, and just pray that it grows back. Big thing. Nicola was founded by John Nicola over 25 years ago. Big belief in our firm is to share the pie, pay it forward. And we recognize that not everyone can do that financially as an organization, even our own team. So we donate 3% of our profits every year to causes. A lot of it through Nicola Gives Back, which is our own internal charity, to empower our staff to go out and do good in the community. So if you can't donate, you can donate time. We'll give you that time off. Go and take the time. We paid last year for 6 of our staff to go on a meet-a-wee excursion to Ecuador and help out there as well. We continue to work with companies and organizations like Opportunity International to spread that. So when Nancy and I chatted about philanthropic events, this was a natural for us. So I'd be happy to share some experiences with you today. So a little bit about our firm. We manage about almost $7 billion, 99% client retention rate, and that's over 25 years. And I think after you see what we go through today, you'll realize why most of our clients are coming through referrals. So globally, I took some stats here. This is from I believe it was an RBC, a research paper that I saw quoting Boston Consulting Group. So globally, you can see that women control 30% of all wealth right now in 2015. That's up from 2018. And more importantly, 44% had grown their wealth independently as entrepreneurs. So that was important. 2020, women are expected to control 72 trillion, or 32% of all wealth, up from 51 trillion. And although there are still far more high net worth men than women, the proportion of the wealthiest women to men, survey those with 5 million or more, almost the same. So we're just starting to see some changes. And it's because of millennial women as well. Millennial women are entering the highest circles of asset ownership, faster than women born earlier, and have $5 million or more in assets. They come in at 32%. So half of millennial women created their own wealth, which is fantastic. It's empowering, and it's really important. And 72% of millennial women are the primary decision makers for financial planning. So I do tell my mom, who's not a millennial, I said, you were a groundbreaker, because to this date, you know, my dad wouldn't even know how to pay a credit card or take money. He doesn't know how to take money out of a bank machine, right? He works hard. She gives him the money. She controls everything. She runs the family business. You know, he's an indentured employee, I will say. But it's worked, and it's been a really good role model, I think, for our family to see that. In Canada specifically, this is a CIBC study today, about 3 trillion almost of wealth, and that's expected to hit over 4 trillion in 2028. So why we talk about the wealth is it does lead to the issue of philanthropy. Typically, we will break down philanthropy into 3 approaches. One is at the door, or I call it at the door. One is planned giving, which most of us are used to and seeing, working with great organization. The third is one that's probably not talked about often, and that's strategic philanthropy. And I'm going to touch upon that at the end. So at the door, typical friends and family, people come to the door, they ask you, you're going to walk-a-thon. These are important things. They sustain many of the organizations. Movember, for example, things like that. That's what I would call at the door. Important, absolutely, and we should continue to do those things. Planned giving. Now, why do I have tax rates up on planned giving? Because that's where a lot of planned giving strategies currently are driven by people's need to help out and not be taxed punitively as a result. So for today, I want to just highlight some numbers. If you're giving out of your RSP, today income in Ontario is 54%. If you've got capital gains, so you sold some shares that appreciated, or investment real estate, or your business, it's a 26% tax rate you're paying. If you have a corporation, a holding company, or a corporation of some kind, and you're paying out of that, retained earnings, shares, real estate, cash, it's a 45%. So the government really isn't helping us get money out and then push that down. So we need to be creative, and we need to be better at helping our clients and our community in getting that out. In addition, there's a small probate fee in Ontario. So let's look at, what is tax-free? Your principal residence, tax-free savings account, lottery winnings, not enough of those, I think, and tax-exempt life insurance. And so we'll focus on some strategies around the last one a bit later. So we want to look at the tax grind, as we call it. So if you had $1 million in a portfolio and it made 4% for 25 years, in a zero tax environment, we'd have 2.6 million, a little bit over. But unfortunately, we live in an environment where there is tax, nearly 54%, so it grinds it down from 2.6, you're netting out $1 million. Now again, let's be mindful that that $1.5 million is redistributed back into the healthcare system, into roads. So it's not that it's lost, it's important, but if we can look at other ways of benefiting philanthropic organizations while reducing the tax burden, that's something that we're open to. So who are your three possible beneficiaries from your assets? You know, your family, your charity, and the government. And you, for the most part, you can choose 2 of 3. How many of you would choose the last one if you chose? Said, hey, at the end of my lifetime, I want to make sure the government gets most of my assets. Probably not. And we're going to go through an example of that shortly. So most of us do not want the government to get a majority of our assets. So there was an old saying by Morgan Stanley, a wealth management firm down in the States: you must pay taxes, but there's no law that says you got to leave a tip behind. And it's true. We're just talking about paying your fair share, but with good structures, good planning, you can actually leave more behind for the people and the organizations, institutions that are most important to you. And so that's what we're hoping to get through today. So let's look at a scenario. We have 2 individuals, Mr. Brown and Ms. Smith. Both are identical in every way. 50 years young, they're married, they have kids, they have no debt, they make about $750,000 a year in earnings, they're high income earners. They have, you know, and so to give you a sense, that's a medical practitioner. A lot of high-end medical practitioners or high-end dentists or business owners are making about that. We're seeing that. Now again, I'm just showing you this for an example, but the percentages are about the same. If they had $500,000 in RSPs and they were able to save $1.2 million in corporate investments thus far, both were on a retire at 70, nothing is different between these 2. Well, Mr. Brown says, I don't have any need for life insurance, Ron. You know, my spouse will have more than enough, and he's right. At 70, there'll be nearly $8 million in corporate savings and $2.5 million in RSP. Ms. Smith is a little brighter than Mr. Brown, and she decides she's going to take, of this $250,000, she's going to put $150 into the corporation and $100 into the whole life policy. At age 70, there's a little less money, $6 million versus 8.7, but there's also this life insurance cash value with a death benefit. The real transformational piece we're going to see is over here. There are 3 levels of tax when you own a corporation. There is the first part, the personal capital gain disposition on the shares of the corporation. So I have a corporation, whether it's an operating company or holding company, I've got tax on whatever the disposition of that share. So if it's worth $2 million, for example, and the adjusted cost base was $1, because that's what it cost me, I've got to pay tax on the disposition of that $2 million. The next level of tax on that, whatever's left, is the corporate tax on the sale of corporate investments. Many corporations will have stocks, bonds, shares, mutual funds. So now you're selling those. Now there's a tax on that. And then the last piece is, well, you want to get this out to your inheritors, so there's a disposition there. So let's look at what the net effect is. Mr. Brown is left with 1.8 million. Ms. Smith, because she had the life insurance placed, 10.7. So Mr. Brown, he was only focused on asset accumulation, right? Oh, my wife will have enough. 71% of his assets were lost to tax. And a lot of people, if you have a corporation, don't recognize the 3 levels of tax. If you don't have a corporation, you still have significant levels of tax if you have appreciated capital and property. Ms. Smith only paid 29%. So it wasn't about saving more, it was just about redirecting at a point in life to a different asset class that would benefit their beneficiaries, whether it was family or whether it was charity. So you have a number of gifting options. You can do it through your will. Many people will do that. You can do it through your RSP and your RIF. You can do it through marketable securities and life insurance. We'll look at a little bit of each. Will is you change your will. You just say, hey, I'm going to leave a fixed amount, X dollars, or a percentage of the estate to named favorite charities. One of the things that I would caution you on is if you're putting a dollar amount, is $100,000, which is very generous today to leave to an organization, the same as 20 years from now, or 25 or 30. So update your wills, take a look at them. Is that number still reflective? Can you afford to still give those things? So that's why it's important to look at that. In terms of a percentage, it's the same thing. If you say I want to give 75% to my children, 25% to a charity, that's fine today, but in 10 years from now, has your children's situation changed? Maybe they don't need the money, or maybe they need more money. Something's happened. So it's really important to continue to look at those things and not put them away in the drawer and say, okay, I've done my will. The second is to notify the financial institution. You need to include the named favorite charity as a beneficiary for some or all of your RSP. So you might say, hey, I'm going to leave some of that RSP or RIF to a charity. It's important they know that, because they can then bring in professionals to assist you in the most tax-efficient way to get the maximum impact for that donation. But keep in mind that your RSP and your RIF is really a tax time bomb. What happens is the government discriminates against single people, divorcees, and widows. Because when I pass away, I'm married, my RSP or RIF will roll over tax-free to my spouse. But my spouse's RSP RIF will not roll over to anyone tax-free. There will be a taxable consequence. At death, everything is considered income. So if you have a $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 RIF, maybe your spouse does too, and God forbid something happens to one of you, the other one now has $600,000. Half of that will be gone to taxes. That's why you need to look at other alternative ways of mitigating that. So, you know, at death, if you had a $2 million combined RSP or RIF, $920,000 to your heirs, wealthy people generally do take your RIF minimums. So we're not really drawing down on it. So we need to look at other alternatives. What we tell people is try and think about gifting the RIF. So if you had $2 million and year one withdrawal was $106,000, because that's the minimum withdrawal, afterwards, you'd have a net income of about $48,000. Why not consider taking that $48,000 from your RIF and buy a $1.2 million life insurance policy? Not because you need the money, but it's a very transformational gift. You could give $48,000 to a charity. That's good. As I said, giving at the door is needed. Planned giving is needed. But if you were to take that $48,000, a long-term gift of $1.2 million for the charity of your choice. Your beneficiary could have $600,000 and $600,000 to charity, and beneficiaries get $600,000. So in our case here, we said, well, let's make sure there's something left for the kids. $600,000 for them, $600,000 to the charity. You get a $600,000 tax receipt for the estate upon death. And what that means is the heirs, in our example here, would be netted $900,000 and the net after-tax balance of the RIF. And more importantly, the charity gets what they were looking for. So it doesn't have to be an all or none scenario. This is why it's important to work with your advisors on this. Someone mentioned earlier gifting marketable securities. So a quick example, if you had $50,000 that you were giving annually, or one of your donors was giving cash, there's another way of helping them out. Now we tell the client, you know what, give $50,000 in shares. Perhaps it costs that individual $10,000, so there's a $40,000 gain. He or she could have sold that $40,000 gain, there would have been a $20,000 capital gain and top tax rate about $10,000 tax payable there. In this scenario, they saved that $10,000 tax because they donated the full donation of $50,000. They get a full tax receipt of $50,000, so it's a win-win. You get the tax receipt for $50,000, you save the capital gains tax. So again, another different way of approaching philanthropy. And I know many organizations are working with their donors to look at that. Because donors don't want to pay taxes. Surprise, none of us want to pay taxes. So if there's a way we can show you how to do that, it's really important we do that as advisors. Gifting life insurance, I think, as our demographic continues to age out, and as we start to see the accumulation of wealth transfer over, I think this is going to become a bigger and bigger opportunity for organizations and for individuals to make meaningful contributions to their local organizations. So you can gift an existing policy, including any term life policies. So some people might say, well, Ron, I'm not healthy anymore. You know, I have a policy in place. I'll never need it, or my spouse won't need it. Let's gift that policy because I can't get underwritten. I'm not healthy anymore. And that's fine. You can still gift existing policies, including term. You get a receipt for the full fair market value. So that's important. And especially with term insurance, people think, oh, there's no cash value. But there's what's called a fair market value. It involves an actuarial evaluation, but it says, you know, how much would it cost me today, or how much would this policy be worth today given this person's current health? So I have a term policy on myself that I got, 21 years, my twins are 21, so about 22 years ago. I got a term policy of $760,000. I was healthy, it was fine. 10 years later, I find that I have a heart condition, I'm not medically underwritable. So today, if I wanted to take that $760,000 policy, it's worth nothing because it's term. I haven't died, so no one's getting paid. But if I were to donate it, the value of a policy like that today is enormous because I can't get underwritten. So the actuary would say, wow, this is like a huge value to somebody because guess what, Ron, you're going to die at some point. Right? There's a guarantee there. And so they know that there's a value there. And so we can look at a receipt for the full fair market value. You would also get charitable receipts for future premiums. So if you're going to continue funding that policy, which is absolutely critical to keep that policy in place, you would get future premiums. Or you could gift a new policy. You might say, okay, I'm healthy, relatively healthy. My spouse and I can underwrite, especially people living out in this community. They're outdoors, they're far more active than the sedentary individuals in the Greater Toronto area. You would absolutely qualify, and you get those opportunities to do a new policy. An annual premium is then eligible for your tax receipts. Can you gift insurance death benefit? That's another option. And so you get a tax receipt issued for the entire death benefit and offset the estate taxes. You don't have to do one or the other. Sometimes we see clients do a little bit of both and split the policy up. Say, okay, I'm going to change the beneficiary, as we showed earlier, half to my estate or half to my kids, and the other half to charities, or they put multiple strategies into place. Under scenario 2 and 3, which is gifting a new policy or gifting insurance death benefit, you still have control over the policy. Right? Things change. We recognize that. So you might say, look, my intention is to give to X, Y, Z. But as I said, 10 years from now, if one of your children is in a bad situation, you say, okay, you know what? As much as I want to help the charity out, I've got to change this back to one of my kids. So there is still some control over that policy. So you can change the beneficiary. You can donate the death benefit through a will or designate the charity under the policy. But if it's through your will, you got to watch out for probate fees and something called dependent relief claims. Maybe Mira can talk to that a bit later. One thing that a lot of people in this room, how many of us are going to be eligible or are collecting Canada Pension Plan at some point? Most of us, right? We put into it and we're going to collect it. One of the things that we're working with our clients, especially those who perhaps don't need the pension, so they paid into it and they're going to collect it, but they don't need the income, is what we call CPP for philanthropy. So these are taxed, invested, and retaxed, of course. So you were taxed on it, Now it's been reinvested for you in the Canada Pension Plan. They've done a fantastic job, I have to say. And now you're going to receive it as income, and guess what? They're taxing it again. So redistribution of wealth, it's important. It's what our society is founded on. But what if we could find a way to take some of that wealth and redistribute it in a different way? So could you use your CPP to create a charitable gift of life insurance? A 65-year-old couple can today get a $1.4 million policy with their CPP benefits. So if you looked at your statements and your bank statement said, look, I don't need this money, yes, you could take that money today and write a check to a charity of your choice. Again, that's important, that ongoing contribution. Or you can get a joint last to die policy, and when the last of you is gone, you get a $1.4 million gift, which is really important. So it's a meaningful windfall either for the family and the charity, and again, those receipts would be taxable as discussed, or non-taxable, sorry, tax deductible. So I want to talk a little bit about, this is all planned giving, different ways of doing it, strategic philanthropy. And this is a big part of what we do at our firm. When we talk about strategic philanthropy, it's not, hey, let's wait until you've accumulated assets. We're having these discussions at every stage in life, whether our clients are millennials, whether they're retirees, working, whatever the case is, we're always talking about what's important to you from a strategic philanthropy perspective. Because as planners, whether it's trust and estate planners or whether it's certified financial planners, we start looking down the road and say, okay, if we did today small things, could we be impactful in a much greater way? And so strategic philanthropy for us is having those conversations with your advisors, insurance, investment advisors, will and estate people regularly. Are they being met? And how do you do that? Because most of us, this is a typical scenario for most of our clients. They're working, they're accumulating assets. There may be a sale of a business or some real estate, sold their house in Toronto, come up here, bank a little bit of money. Most of our clients are never going to eat into their capital, and they start drawing down on their investments, but there's always this excess capital, almost always for our clients. And so if we're having conversations at this stage, and this stage, we can minimize a lot of the taxes, and we can ensure that your legacies are met and your desires are met. So it is about you holding your advisors accountable. Most advisors are not going to bring the concept of philanthropy up, quite frankly, because of the way advisors are compensated. If they don't sell you something, they're not eating. And we do need to pay people for good work and good value. This is not about slamming my industry. This is about ensuring that whatever service you're paying for, you're holding them accountable to your needs and services. Just like if I came to any of your establishments, I would expect a high level of professionalism and service. I'm always benchmarking you against others, and I'll come back and be a repeat customer if it meets my needs. And I think that's why we have that 99% client retention. And I think that's because a lot of advisors focus on this, retirement income modeling, or they invest. These are the two things that most of them do. Our firm really started as a planning firm, so we incorporate charitable discussions in every conversation. And perhaps there's insurance needs for business, family, wills and estate, legacy planning, tax reduction. You can see there isn't one that's more important than the other. For some clients, we might start with tax reduction strategies. For some, it might be, can you help me with structuring my corporation for succession? Might be retirement income modeling, but it's an ongoing collaborative process. I will say this to you, and I say this to every client, no one cares about your money more than you, unless it's your kids maybe, but, or your spouse. But honestly, as much as we as advisors have a fiduciary obligation, you're the ones who have to take ownership of it. You're the ones who have to make the time, and I get it, we're all busy, right? Running a business, running a family, raising kids. I get what that's like, but it's important to make that time, because it's one thing that we don't get back is that time, and it's that power of time that really makes a difference for a lot of individuals. I want to spend just 2 or 3 minutes talking about our private giving foundation. So, because we work with a lot of high net worth individuals, we set up our own donor advised foundation. And what we had found, not surprisingly, business owners are busy, right? So we'd get a call from somebody saying, oh my God, it's, November 30th, and I've got 30 days to make my calendar year contribution because I just sold my business. I've got a $1.5 million tax bill. I don't know which fantastic charity or charities of my choice I want to give the money to. So we often will counsel them to put it into the private giving foundation, and from that, they can do further distributions at a later time. So they get the immediate tax benefit. It is a donor-advised fund. It's a registered charity. It accepts donations, issues tax receipts, makes grants to other Canadian registered charities. And what we find is it strategically maximizes tax benefits of large contributions in a given year. So you don't have to try and figure out today. You can work with the great organizations here and say, okay, I've made my gift to the donor-advised fund. It's my family's foundation. And so I'm going to talk about that in a moment, why it's important to have a family foundation. And then you can start giving that out over time. And you can grow your legacy, make donations during lean years, continue giving in perpetuity. There's all sorts of flexibility here. And for those who would want, I have put in the front a little bit on the private giving foundation. There's a piece there. The donations can be made in cash or with securities, like we talked about, insurance policies, real estate. And under circumstances, even private company shares can be donated. So this should be discussed with your advisor. One of the things is we do believe in giving back. I talked about giving 3% of our overall profits to charities. And we also believe that we shouldn't be then benefiting. So what we'll do is the cost to administer the foundation is actually absorbed by our firm out of our Nicola Gives Back so that more dollars can go. Now, one of the things that we have found is that financial literacy is something that's really important to our clients for the younger generation, perhaps. So a lot of our clients will say, okay, around Christmas or maybe sometime when the family's together, say, hey guys, what's our charities of choice this year? This year we have X dollars we can allocate to charities. And they ask the kids to go out and do the research. Okay, I like dogs, or I want to donate to Alzheimer's or to a certain hospital, whatever the case is. But then it's, well, why? It's not just about, oh, I like puppies, and I do. I have 2 rescues, by the way. It is about encouraging the children to dig deeper and find what resonates with them. You talked about empowering our children to make those decisions. Now they're a part of the financial decision. So really, we find is a great way to educate younger people on that. So, last piece. What does this guy have to do with philanthropy? 1982, John Lennon put out an album called Double Fantasy. There's a beautiful song on there called Beautiful Boy, and in it he says, take my hand as we cross the street. Life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. And so you think about today, you made plans, you were very purposeful today in being here. This wasn't a charity event. You spent your money and, more importantly, your time to be here. You made the plan to be here. Seize on that in terms of your financial and philanthropic goals, and also, please, make the time to work with your advisors on that. The legal person in the back will appreciate the slide. Everybody else, I can give it to you if you really want it. Basically says, don't rely on this, call me, right? Every situation is different. And with that, I will end here. I will just also put out to any of you who are with an organization up here in this area, if you would like myself to come out and speak to your donors one-on-one or in a group environment, that is part of what I'm willing to do, come back here and give back and do that. I know there's a question over here. Thank you. Okay, so the question is, thank you, the question is difference between an RSP and a RIF. So a retirement savings plan, or an RRSP, a registered retirement saving plan, is like a bucket. It's a house. It's a plan that you put money into. And in that house, or in that bucket, you can invest different things: stocks, bonds, GICs, term deposits, mutual funds, and so forth. At some point, the government says, that's great that you've saved, and we've given you a tax deduction along the way. It's really a tax deferment. Because now, at the age of 71, you have to convert it to what's called a RIF, Registered Retirement Income Fund. So it's the same assets, but we've just changed it. And now instead of putting money in, you can't put more money in. You've got to withdraw it. And there's a prescribed minimum. And that's why, you know, if you're only taking out the minimum, right, any money that you take out of that, doesn't matter if it was in stocks or bonds and had capital gains, any money is pure income. It's like salary. So that's why when you have a $600,000 or $700,000 combined RIF as a family, and the last of you is gone, it's like that year you made $700,000. It was tax-free until that point. Yes, at 71, you're paying money on the taxes that you have to take out, the minimum. And when you die, and that should be like 95 or 100, right, whatever that is, but when you pass on, the last of you, that full amount that's in there is full taxable income. So if you have $700,000 in your RIF upon death, you just made $700,000 in income, or your estate did, right, and your what we call a terminal return. And half of that, unless you got proper planning, half of that goes to the government. If you cash out your RSP, it's considered income. Yeah. So these are great questions, and I'm glad that these are the types of things that I would encourage each one of you, like, ask the questions. In our firm, one of the things that, and I didn't talk about this, is a little unique, is you don't work with Ron necessarily, you work with Ron and Jessica, or Ron and Kyle. We have 2 advisors on every client file. One of the reasons is continuity, so we know your family. Another reason is diversity. Like, I might not get along with certain people, or they just might not get along with me, and we need to be able to build a relationship built on long-term trust. If you're going to share with us probably your second most important thing, your family being first, and your health, secondly is finances. If you're going to share everything about that, and we hear as advisors and as lawyers, we hear, you know, stories like, okay, you know, my son is this, or my daughter is that, or I'm having problems. You know, if it's a blended family, these are things that it's important that you don't have to tell these stories 7 times in your financial lifetime. So that's why we want to work with people, and that's why we have a 99% client retention rate. We look at the family as a whole. We'll often work with multiple generations because if the money is going to go to the kids, how can we make sure that that's most tax efficient? What are we doing in terms of as an organization to ensure there's financial literacy? So, great question. I want to maybe hold the questions for now because I want to give Mira the time. And then Mira and I will take questions because I think some of what she's going to say may dovetail into this. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, so I'm going to start at ground zero for wills, just so that we're all on the same page for the uninitiated, and so we have some terms of reference in case we have questions going forward. I think this is the way that everybody thinks of their will and estate planning. You have a big pile of money at the end. It's going to be huge, right? And then pursuant to whatever your will says, that's how it's going to pass to your beneficiaries. You have to think about what is going to be in this big pile of money at the end of the day. There's 2 things that are not going to be in that big pile of money at the end of the day. Anything that has a beneficiary designation. So Ron has already talked about a lot of these things, but things like your TFSA, your RRSP, life insurance policies, anything that you can name someone on as a beneficiary, that's going to pass directly to that beneficiary. It's not going to go through the estate. It has its own tax implications, and your will is not going to be impacted. Your will is not going to impact that transfer. The second thing is anything held jointly. So it doesn't just mean 2 people on title. Joint ownership is an official legal type of way that you can hold title to a property. If you hold title jointly, if me and my spouse hold our real estate, the home that we live in together jointly, it would pass automatically to the survivor of that joint ownership on death. Doesn't go through the will, same thing, the will doesn't impact what happens to that piece. So when you're thinking about your will, you're really thinking about what assets are in there that don't have a beneficiary designation and are not held jointly. The major issue that comes up for everyone is if you have a piece of real estate in that big pile of money at the end of the day. Because if you have real estate in your estate, it triggers something called the probate process. So What is probate? I always explain probate as it's very similar to that part of the wedding ceremony when they say, is there any reason why these two people shouldn't be joined? It's kind of like the court saying, is there any reason why this is not the last will and testament of Mira Ortved? There's no actual, rarely is there an actual hearing unless someone comes out of the woodworks and says, nope, on her deathbed, Mira promised me everything, throw that will out, this is the last one. And if that happens, they have an actual court case, they hear who is going to be, which will is going to be the right one. At the end of the day, the court stamps it and says, okay, this is the official will, and they give the person who's the executor a certificate of appointment, I forget the full word, a certificate of appointment. And so once they have the certificate of appointment, they can go to the land registry office, they can sell the property. If there's anything else that triggers probate, that probate is required for, they can show that certificate to go get the thing moved around from one place to another. What is the probate fee? So it's not a tax, it's called a tax, but it is a fee. As Ron highlighted, it's usually considered to be about 1.5% of the value of the estate. These are the actual rule breakdowns. Probably we're going to be focusing on this lower one here because, knock on wood, everyone's going to be passing away after January 2020. So if you have an estate valued at less than $50,000, you don't pay any probate fee. If it's over $50,000, it's the $15 for every $1,000. So the idea being that you kind of want to avoid probate if you can, right? You don't want to go through this process. It takes a lot of time. We usually say weeks to months, but it can take up to 6 months right now to get probate. Then you're waiting that 6 months to be able to deal with your assets and deal with selling things. Plus you have to pay this extra fee to the government, which is exactly what Ron was talking about, making the government one of your beneficiaries under your will. So I'm going to go back for a second. This is really a hidden women's issue. I'm not going to get on a soapbox and explain, all of our women's rights, but you can imagine that probably if you're in a spousal relationship right now, that when you pass away, the first person to pass away, everything's going to transfer to the other person jointly. There might be 1 or 2 bank accounts that are held independently, and those are the 1 or 2 things that are going to go into the estate there. But largely everything else is going to pass to the surviving spouse. It's the surviving spouse who has the real estate in their bucket, in their pile at the end of the day. And just by virtue of numbers and health and wealth and the way it works right now, women are largely the surviving spouse. So this is something we really need to be thinking about and planning for and understanding and being a part of the discussion now because, like I said, it's our issue. So that's estate planning in a nutshell. Let's talk about philanthropy and estate planning. So what can you do to maximize philanthropy or give in your lifetime and not in your lifetime? Strategy number 1 is to preserve as much of your estate as possible. So that's trying to avoid the probate fees and any other kind of fees, tax planning, so that you don't have to pay as much to the government as you would. Oh, I'm going backwards. Okay, dual wills. This is a very effective way of trying to avoid probate or to pay the least amount of probate that you have to. What we do in the dual wills scenario is we draft 2 identical wills for the same person. And we divide the big pile of assets into 2 piles of assets. We say this will is just going to deal with all my assets that don't need probate for them. So we can just administer that will right away as soon as I pass away. This will is going to deal with everything that needs probate. So just the minimum of what needs the probate process or the estate certificate of appointment is the only thing that is going to go through that court process, and so I only have to pay 1.5% on the value of what's inside this estate. There was a very savvy / probably had lots of advisors, couple way back in the day, I want to say in the 80s, and they had a holdco and an opco. Both were worth somewhere in the ballpark of $20 million, and they came up with this strategy of drafting these 2 identical wills. And the value of the estate was worth having all these advisors come in and plan this out. It was also worth the court fees and the legal fees of going through the court process when that person passed away to decide to see how the courts would treat this new type of strategy. And they said they accepted it. So a lot of lawyers started advising all their clients who had corporate assets, hey, this strategy looks like it's going to work. The courts approved it. we're not giving you the final seal of approval. The government could come down at any time and change legislation and say, no dice, we want all of our money, we want all of our probate fees. Fancy lawyers can't, draft their way out of this. Two things happened in the last 2 years. So first of all, there was the probate process it's a full court hearing when I said that someone's challenging it, but otherwise you're really just submitting a bunch of paperwork to the court office, and eventually the judge looks it over and stamps it. There was a judge in Toronto who practices largely criminal law, got this will passed through his office. He was like, I don't understand this. This makes no sense. Forget it. He called the lawyer in. I think she was so bowled over by being asked to go into the court to talk about this issue at all. She was like, what could you possibly want? And he rejected the whole will. So this threw virtually everybody in the estate planning legal world into a tailspin, including especially the insurer of all the lawyers. So very quickly, that case was brought to the appeal court. It went in 6 months, which is very fast. But it was because everyone was very concerned that all this tax planning and estate planning had been done that wasn't going to be accepted. And the Court of Appeal very quickly said, no, everybody who practices in the States understands this concept. It's been accepted for a long time. We're okay with it. You can all continue on your way doing the dual wills. The second thing that happened is you probably saw in the news, the Trudeau government was cramping down on the 1% by going after all the small mom and pop corporations and changing all the rules about tax planning that way. They also changed some rules about trusts and how the trusts are taxed. They didn't touch dual wills. So that was kind of like an implicit communication from the government saying, we're not going to touch this, it's okay, continue to plan this way. So this is now becoming, well, it is very widely accepted, and we're not just saying anybody with a corporation should do this. Anybody whose estate is valued at enough that it would make sense to spend $1,000 on a will, that's how much it's going to cost to do the two of them. Well, that's how much our firm charges to do the two of them for a very standard situation where there's not a lot of other complex planning. I did not put the same slide up that Ron did, but this is not legal advice. You should go get your own independent legal advice on your particular situation. Anyways, so you should definitely consider putting dual wills in for everybody across the board, as long as your estate is worth enough to spend that much money on it. Okay, there's another strategy for the surviving spouse. And this has to do with this area of the whole estate planning concept. So we're going to focus on joint ownership. You might have thought, hey, another way I could get around that whole probate issue is if I just name someone else on all of my assets with me. Likely your child is who you were thinking of, or maybe a friend or something like that. I don't see a friend very often that happening, but usually it's children. There's a lot of perils with that. First of all, you lose control over let's talk about your home that you live in. You lose control over title to that home. So if you ever need to mortgage the home, if you ever need to sell, if your child wants you to sell and you don't want to sell, you have to get these two people to agree. And I'm sure you agree with your children about a lot of things, but I just protect you against all the worst case scenarios when that relationship breaks down. What's the other thing? Oh, you're exposed to everything that other person is exposed to from a legal perspective. So if your child's marriage breaks down, now the value of that asset is in their net family property for when they're dividing up their property between them and their spouse. Makes your house subject to that whole separation. You could lose your house that way. Bankruptcy and insolvency. If your child goes through any of those kind of processes, your house is subject to that. You could very easily lose your house that way. Legal actions. So you don't think about your child getting sued very often, but think about creditor claims. If they have credit cards that you don't know about or more leverage than you thought that they were, and now creditors are coming after them, it can impact your house.
Would it be safe to say that's a good thing to do closer to the end of your life?
I'm going to tell you, you should think about all those things all the time, but it's a cost-benefit analysis. If you really are in the right situation and it's right for you, then you should think about doing it. But let's talk about another strategy, which cuts around, the other thing actually I just want to talk about before I leave this is tax consequences. So transferring it into joint ownership still attracts capital gains and land transfer tax, so you have costs of doing it. So we have something called a bare trust. you probably have heard of trusts before, and trusts are at the very root of it, doing exactly what I've said here, is changing registered title and, oh, I didn't list it this way, sorry. Changing registered title and beneficial ownership. So registered title might be my brother is on title, but beneficial ownership is me. And under that, the traditional trust conceptualization, my brother, who's the trustee, he's got a job. He has to manage my bank account. He has to manage my real estate property for the benefit of me. And my rights are that I can enforce the trust. I can say, you have to do all these things for me. A bearer trustee, oh, sorry, before I get to that, I'm just also going to talk about, so sometimes you think about trusts as a family trust. Sometimes we think of cottages and second homes. Strategies for passing them on is to use a trust. Blended families, we sometimes use a trust so that there's a trust for the surviving spouse, but then the remainder goes to the children of the deceased. And, for incapable people. So I think we've all heard about those kind of trusts before, where you might be managing property on behalf of a minor or something like that. So a bearer trust is different. The trustee doesn't have a whole bunch of jobs to do. They're not managing all the assets. They have 2 jobs. They have to transfer the asset back to you if you ask them to transfer it back, and they have to dispose of the property pursuant to your will. That's their only 2 jobs. Otherwise, the trustee stays on, and they have the full beneficial ownership in the property. So you would set up 2 bearer trusts. You would set up one for your real estate property. So the registered title would say mom and child as joint tenants, and the trust agreement would say the mom is the real owner here, the child is just on so that she will or he will pass the asset on pursuant to the will when I pass away. And when you pass away, passes the same way as I was saying with joint ownership. It just goes directly to that child, and then the child has to do what the trust agreement says. They can be sued on the trust agreement.
Even if they're one of the beneficiaries?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And then registered title to, any financial assets. So I think Ron can answer this better than I can, but I'm pretty sure anything that's a registered plan, you can put a beneficiary on. So these are non-registered plans that we're talking about. So you can put the joint ownership on that. So if CRA comes knocking and says, hey, there's 2 people on title, how come they're not both reporting their income? You show them the trust agreement that says just the beneficial owner reports this income on their taxes. If there's ever been a transfer of interest, that the trust agreement dictates that as well. Sorry, was there a question over here? Oh, sorry, you had a question. I thought you were pointing to someone else.
So today, November 2nd, trust agreement, you do it, 3 years goes by, that you have a pretty good feeling that it's still legal in 3 years, 5, 10?
Oh, this is not a conceptual, this is not a, lawyers didn't dream this one up. This isn't like dual wills where they made this new kind of system and are testing it in the courts. Bearer trusts are something that exists in law for many years and are tried and true. See, we've had CRA challenge them, we've sent in the trust agreement, and we've had no problems with it. Mm-hmm. Okay. Another strategy for keeping as much out of the probate process as possible is beneficiary designations. So this is a situation where we're talking about this area of the estate planning, and it relates to that saying, if you can, you must. If there's any time that you can name a beneficiary on an account or on an asset, you must. That's the best way to get it out of that big pile of money. Some wills will talk about the registered plans, like the RSPs and things like that, and they'll say, transfer my RSPs to so-and-so. You have to make sure, or you're going to have major legal problems, well, you won't, but your estate will, that those beneficiary designations in your will match what's in the registered plan as well. They have to be identical. So you want to always be thinking about your beneficiaries. When do you need to update them? We say every 5 years. Also with any major life change, if you're ever moving, think about why you're moving and do you need to update things. You want to keep everything up to date as much as possible. The next strategy is gifts made in your death. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Should I leave money to philanthropy through a margin account or through the RIP account?
That is a very good question for Ron. Do you want to?
I'll take it after.
Yeah? Okay. So the second strategy is giving in your will. So that's called a testamentary gift in the legal world. So you can give stuff like securities that people were talking about before. I put a really basic example up, like to my daughter, Jane Doe, if she survives me, my wedding ring, because that's a really easy way to think about it. But you can also think about, you know, a certain account or a certain amount of securities or shares. You can list in your will this big list, to my daughter this, to my son this, to the hospital foundation this, to the Humane Society this. If you ever, in 5 years from now, in 2 days from now, change your mind about what you want on that list, you have to go back to the lawyer, make a new will, pay for it again. So one strategy we try to do is to keep the list outside of the will. And what we say is, if there's a list, do it pursuant to the list. Distribute my wedding ring pursuant to the list. If there's no list or there's stuff left over that wasn't on the list, like the couch and the artwork and the grandfather clock, the kids get to choose what they want from that. And I always put in, if the kids fight over any item, it's sold. And that's the deterrent against them fighting over something to the point of it becoming depletion of the estate. Now with securities and with a charitable gift, I wouldn't do it outside the will. I would definitely do it in the will. But with other kinds of things, you want to think of it that way. Financial gifts, Ron talked about this a little bit. So should you give if you're giving a financial gift, like not just a securities, but maybe you're giving part of your whole estate to a charity, should you give a percentage or an amount? I mean, he talked about, think about what that amount is going to be worth 20 years from now. We think about the consequences for the rest of the beneficiaries if you give a set amount. Let's say you give $100,000 and then the remainder to be divided up among your 4 children, but you live to be 102, you know, far out, spending far more than you thought you would of your estate, and now you have, you know, only $20,000 for each child to have. I'm sure if you were 102, they wouldn't be dependent on you at that point financially, but you want to think about what's going to be left for everyone. So percentages guard against any kind of hardship that you weren't expecting in a much better way. So I would say that percentages are more favorable. If you gift in your will, you have to be very specific and very general. So you have to be very specific in the sense you have to use the right language, saying, I want to give to the Collingwood General Marine Hospital Foundation. It can't just be to the hospital in Collingwood. You know, we have to be specific that way. But the reason that these charitable gifts fail the most is because they become too specific. You know, to buy an MRI machine in the such and such department, in the, you know, such and such department for such and such person to use. I mean, you wouldn't say for someone to use, but if you get too specific, it could be that in 20 years from now, they don't need an MRI machine, that department doesn't exist anymore. Then we have this language that the estate executor has to follow precisely to the word, and they can't. So what do they do in that situation? You're spending on legal fees for someone to figure out that whole equation. So if you just say to the hospital foundation, maybe have a talk with your children or with the person who's going to be the executor of your estate to say, I really want this to go to breast cancer research, or I really want this to go to something that's going to be a women's issue at the time, you know, in 20 years when I pass away, so that they know your wishes. And even though it's going generally to the hospital foundation, when they go and execute that part of your will, they can say, I know this is what she really wanted to do. Can we try and focus on that so that her wishes are respected, but it's not going to fail the gift.
I want to ask about the koozie factor.
Okay.
What my lawyer calls the koozie factor. So you've got all this figured out, it's all in your will, you die, your ex and your husband married a woman. Change his will for everything.
Yeah.
You're not the other way around. Is that a challenge in probate court?
Good news and bad news on that front. So first of all, you can't stop someone from marrying someone else, and marriage revokes the prior will. So just by virtue of getting married and putting a ring on it, this whole thing gets thrown out the window. You also can't contract someone into saying you can't make a new will. What you can do is have strategies for trying to preserve that, like using a trust. Ron and I were just talking about this beforehand, actually. So you could set things up in a trust that says, maybe the husband is the trustee of the trust, but the trust provisions will say you have to use it for A, B, C, D, E, F. This is not the bare trust. This is the more specific trust where there's a stronger obligation for them to follow there's more rules for them to follow. They still have the same obligation, excuse me. And then the final thing is, yeah, everything is challengeable depending on the facts. If it's, very clear that someone was under duress or they don't have the capacity to be able to make decisions about their life or about their financial life, then there could be grounds there for challenging something like that. And the last strategy I'm going to talk about is do not preserve as much of your wealth as possible. Give it all away during your lifetime. There's lots of good benefits to that. You get to see your gift in action. You have far different tax consequences, which probably Ron can speak a lot to. But this is something that you really want to work with a team in figuring out. You want your lawyer on board, your financial planner on board, and your accountant on board. So you can all think about all the different perspectives, how this is going to have tax implications and how it's going to have financial planning implications. I mean, we think of the worst case scenario, so we're like, are you going to need this money? Do you have enough money to survive until, you live to be 102? And, but, everyone's going to have a different perspective on how to protect your assets best in that kind of situation. So maybe I'll call Ron up to see if there's any questions.
I have one more question. It's a very simple question. I'm sure it gets extremely complicated. Let's say, for instance, in Ontario, you're 90 years old, you have 3 kids, and you have no wealth. What happens?
So in Ontario, in all the provinces, there's called the rules of intestacy, and that's what happens when intestacy means dying without a will. And generally speaking, this is just brushing the surface. There's a list. It says if there's a spouse, it goes to the spouse. If no spouse, it goes to the children. If no children, it goes to the parents. If no parents, the siblings. I can't remember the whole list, but it will trickle down that list. And that is also what happens if wills fail. If that one lawyer who threw away the dual wills and it stood up in court, then that estate would have passed by intestacy, it's called.
Maybe I can just add something to that. Neither of us approach this, but it's not surprising that many of us will have property down in the States, right? So it's really important that if you do own U.S. real estate, or you have a U.S. corporation, or even if you own U.S. stocks and bonds, there are certain rules and regulations you want to make sure that you're working with your accountants, your lawyers, and myself to ensure that you're not taxed in the U.S. on those things. If your estate is very, very large, you could actually, even being a non-resident in Canada, you could be deemed to be a U.S. taxpayer and have your worldwide estate taxed if it's large enough and not structured properly. So it's not often we see that, but life is what happens when you're busy making plans. Sorry, there was a question I want to get to over there first. And I think the question was, should I donate from my RIF or should I donate from my margin account? And the answer is yes. Both. And the reason I say yes, and the word is here, I mean, in legal terms, I would say it depends. It depends on when you want to gift. Depends what your income is that year. Depends what the strategy is. Depends what the assets are. So we've had 10 years of stock market gains. The strategy today is different than 10 years ago when we had stock market losses. And if you're about to sell a business, well, there's something called the capital dividend account, not to get too technical, but there are opportunities through the capital dividend account to do some very creative things. So, I think it's great that you're thinking about gifting. You shouldn't have to worry about where the best way is to maximize that. If you're working with someone who understands the whole picture, that circle I showed you, it should be sufficient for you to say to them, here's what we're thinking as a family. We want to give X dollars. Then your advisor should be saying, okay, well, here are 2 options or 3 options, and here's why I would recommend, pros and cons of each. Yes?
Is the rate of taxation in the margin account equal to the RIF one?
Again, it depends. So it depends what's in the margin account. In this case here, if you had appreciable securities and you're donating them in kind, far more tax efficient than taking it out of your RIF or RSP, right? But if you've sold something, because Apple went from $10 to $1 million, and you've got all this money in there, and you've sold it because you just don't want to take the risk on Apple, because you didn't sell it because you wanted to gift it. You just sold it because you don't want to take the risk on the security. Now you're paying the taxes. There may be opportunities. So it's so important that you are involving your advisors in the gifting discussions before you make the gift. And this is what I talk about, strategic philanthropy. Yes, so I think there was a question over here.
The benefit is to the surviving, the person, the sole owner. So if you're the only person on title, it's a way to put someone else on title to get the joint ownership designation so that you avoid probate. And it's a special kind of trust that achieves that while maintaining more of your control over it and less exposing you to less liability than a traditional joint ownership would. Yep.
When and why would you transition from a trust to a foundation?
You wouldn't necessarily transition between them because they achieve different things. So trust is separating the legal title from the beneficial title. So you're doing that anytime you need to achieve that for different reasons, like to keep a family cottage from passing from one person to another, to keep it into a full family, to preserve money for one person because of their incapacity or the blended family situation. A foundation is different. A foundation is something you're setting up for tax purposes, and maybe Ron can speak more to that. But it's a way to generate money for. Speak on that.
So a foundation can be used in conjunction with your trust. So think about trust as another human being, or it's not a living, breathing entity, but it's just another entity. You don't own the money anymore. The trust does for the benefit of the beneficiaries. Beneficiaries could be your kids, could be a foundation. It could be one of the beneficiaries. Once that foundation receives the money, then whoever we set up in the deed of the foundation, they're the ones now determining where that money goes. So I put $100,000 into there. Under foundation rules in Canada, you have to give about 3.5–4% annually. You can give more. Different foundations, you can actually give less depending on how it's structured. But now that the people managing the trust deed, so again, it could be you. It could be you as an individual, your family, anybody, can now direct that money on an annual basis. And foundations can be wound up. They can be in perpetuity, but they can also be wound up upon the death of the last individual. So you might say, okay, upon my death, in 30 years from now, wind up the foundation, pay everything out. That answer the question? And I think we had a question over here.
Because you raised the U.S. thing, I've been given different comments in this on whether the law has changed. If your trustees for your estate happen to be dual citizens, Canadian and American, but they're living in the States, whenever your will comes up, do they have to post a bond to administer it?
That's more of a legal question, I think.
Yes. And no, it's residency dependent. And same as if they're the executors of your estate. I think sometimes even out of province residents have to put up the same bond as well until the estate is administered in full. Mm-hmm.
Maybe just building on that, you think about your executors, your choice of executors, and your choice of powers of attorney. We didn't talk about that, but if they're living, your kids have moved to Vancouver, are they the ones who should be making the decisions on your health and welfare? And if you're going to stay here, it's difficult. I've got 3 siblings. One lives abroad, one lives with my mom, one lives around the corner from my mom, and I'm about a half hour away. My mom's power of attorney for her physical care, should my father not be around, is the sister who's living with my mom. She can make timely decisions, important decisions. The sister abroad is not going to be involved in any decision making. That's not because she doesn't love her less, but you need that person to be there. Same from an executor perspective, I think. You should probably have the person as close as possible. And where you don't have a person, there's an alternative as well.
Oh, yes, there's lots of people who will step in to be the trustee. That you do have to pay for that fee, though. But it's also just a logistical thing. If you have an acute emergency, you need someone right here, right now to make the decision right away. Not flying from somewhere can be logistically hard. And also, if you're the power of attorney, you're going to be making regular decisions. So you always need to be involved. You always need to be going to the bank. You're probably going to be providing a lot of paperwork to the bank to even get to the process of being able to make the decisions. So it's really a logistical thing about who can be there doing those kind of meetings, having the time for those kind of meetings, and things like that. Any other questions?
It doesn't have to be complicated.
If you have a home and that's your primary residence, you make someone else join on it, just to settle the estate easily enough. If that's not their primary residence, they pay capital gains on that piece of property when it's sold.
Yes, because they're going to be the sole owner, and then when they try to deal with that property, it will be their secondary home. Yes, you're right, they would. If it became their primary home, they would be okay. If it passed through the estate, when the estate sells, that's not capital gains in the same kind of category that way. But if you did the joint ownership and then they became the sole owner, they would have that issue. Correct. Mm-hmm. Any other? Oh, yeah.
I was just thinking, in that case, would you, if you inherited it through that bare trust, and there's no capital gains, it would be advisable to have it valued to pay capital gains going forward.
If you had the bare trust, it would pass to the other person, so they would be the sole owner, and then it would be pursuant to the trust that they would have to distribute it to who the beneficiaries are. And that is a good question. I don't know if capital gains is payable at that transaction, but I think it's possible that it would be. Yeah, you definitely want to sit down, like I said, with the three people, your lawyer, your accountant, and your financial advisor, to think through all the different scenarios and how it's going to play out.
So I know you guys have a lot of great questions. You can feel free to reach out to either of us at any time. We want to be able to and be respectful of other speakers, so we'll be around afterwards. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So, Mira's office is just next door to the LCBO in Collingwood, so it's all very, very convenient. And if there's anybody in here who does not have a current will, or a will at all, make sure you book an appointment with her before the baby's born, because you may miss out on the best advice of all. February. So, and Ron, I said to Ron, if people want to meet with you, could you meet in Mira's office when they too are on the way to the LCBO? So he'll leave cards out there, and Mira will have, you know how to get in touch with her. So that was super, and Mira's terrific. We've known her for a couple of years and referred her to other people, and exceptional every step of the way. So that's fabulous. So now, Lisa, can you come up and introduce Mulaney? Mulaney is a AAA1 gem, and she's been very, very patient to be here all day long. She just spent a week at MIT. She drove back from Boston on Halloween, which was that awful storm. She lives in St. Catharines and then drove up here. And she doesn't miss a beat. She always arrives on time and is always ready to go. So it's my pleasure to let Lisa introduce her, and then you're going to love hearing Mulaney.
Thanks, Nancy. It's actually an incredible honor to be introducing Mulaney today. I had the good fortune to meet her. I don't know if she even recalls that far back, but it was about 4 or 5 years ago. Nancy connected the two of us. My name's Lisa Ferrano, by the way. For those of you who don't know me, I co-created a kids' education charity locally called Elephant Thoughts about 15, 16 years ago. Mulaney and I reached out to her because I had the idea to create a public awareness campaign to help non-Indigenous people understand more about Indigenous issues and history and colonization and all these things that we didn't learn in school, but would love to know more about. So I amassed a national group of advisors and supporters, most of them Indigenous. Mulaney was one of the first to sign on and say, yes, that sounds like a great idea. As I say, that was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm so glad that this has taken so long to take off, because I've learned so much about what it means for someone to embrace an idea or a concept, or why are you going to donate to something, or why are you making a decision about your volunteer time? And all of that is based on a feeling. It's something that's in your heart. And we all experience these things at different times and for different reasons. And I had such a good fortune yesterday to be part of a roundtable discussion with Melanie and Roz and a few other incredible people to talk about why we connect to certain things and what this is all about. And Melanie had such extraordinary insights into this from an Indigenous perspective that not many of us have the ability or the opportunity to understand. So to have her here today is a gift to each and every one of us. And that's my over-the-top intro. Now I want to read you a few stats because this will blow your mind. This is mostly Melanie's, I guess, resume, and I'm going to try to get all these words right, but there's a few things in here that are pretty extraordinary. Melanie Goodchild, Moose Clan, is a member of the Bitigong Nishnabik First Nation in Northern Ontario. She's a founder of the Turtle Island Institute, and this is kind of amusing because it's an Indigenous social innovation think and do tank, which she originally called a teaching lodge, but corporations, as I understand it, didn't really understand the concept of teaching lodge, so she called it an institute so that it would make more sense to them. In her work, she weaves together her unique perspectives, and this is the idea of a connection. And yesterday, particularly, there was a young girl from CCI who was part of the climate initiative, Renee. Many of you probably know her, and she talked about the fact that she's having a lot of trouble getting other students at CCI involved in climate action. And it's the same as everyone trying to get people involved in your cause. There's got to be a feeling inside these kids at CCI. So this is what Melanie is going to help you to understand today. And it's through this weaving together her unique perspectives of Anishinaabe, Gikingdasawan knowledge, with systems thinking and complexity theory and social innovation to address our society's most intractable problems. Melanie believes in the teaching methods of her ancestors in coming to know on the land, and so she supports initiatives that seek to connect people to ceremony, story, art, language, and the land. Now I'm going to skip down to this part that will knock your socks off. Melanie is a facilitator, speaker, and advisor to the Jays Care Foundation, the Engineering Change Lab, the Indigenous Innovation Initiative at Grand Challenges Canada, Reconciliation Canada, NASA's Earth Sciences Capacity Building Program, and most recently, the Academy for Systems Change and Society for Organizational Learning. NASA and these other organizations seek this woman out for advice. It's pretty amazing we've got her here today. Melanie was an International Women's Forum IWF Foundation Fellow in 2015 and 16, an executive leadership program sponsored by Harvard Business School, and a participant in the first ever Getting to Maybe Social Innovation residency at the Banff Center in 2015. And she'll also speak about ideas she has for a new conference at the Banff Center and how to help people to really connect with their hearts and with their feelings through that. So she's a proud member as well of the Iron Butt Association. Apparently, she rides a Harley-Davidson 1,000 miles in 24 hours. So thank you, and please welcome Melanie Goodchild.
Miigwech. This is my new handbag. I thought it warranted an introduction. I got this last week in West Concord, and I loved it. I've always loved spherical things. I'm not sure why. Marbles. It's been called a pumpkin, a basketball, an Easter egg, whatever. I love it. So this just has to make an appearance. So there we go. It's vegan, and it's made by a company that recycles, and I'm not entirely sure if it's hand painted, but I love the designs. Oh yes, that's fantastic. It does. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my friends will be so happy because I premiered it at an art gallery last week, which I thought was fitting. So
I'm going to start by giving an introduction, and then the way that I share information and knowledge is through Deba Jimawin, which is stories. Adzukinna are sacred stories, but Deba Jimawin are stories. And I thought today I would just share a little bit about my leadership journey, which includes testimony to the fact that Nancy is indeed a bit of a stalker, which is wonderful. Empowering women. And I'm going to introduce myself in the traditional way, in the Anishinaabe language, Anishinaabe-Mowin. And then I'm going to show you, rather than tell you, a little bit about Turtle Island Institute, and our wonderful support team here has set up the video for me. So it's a high-resolution video, so hopefully that comes across. It doesn't stall on us. So I say, start my timer. Bojo and Dina Wamagana Duk. Wabshke o getcha da kwez anang indigenous cause, wab nung indigenous cause, moose do dem, big tagong Anishinaabe donjaba, Anishinaabe kwe anda. And when I said Bojo and Dina Wamaganaduk, I said greetings to you, all of my relatives. And then I say Miigwech, Apijago Miigwech Bizindawiyag. Thank you very much for listening. And I hold tobacco when I speak. Sometimes I hold spirit helpers, feathers and rattles and things from my bundle. And what I'm going to talk about today is a teaching called Minagojawin. Minagojawin in Anishinaabe-Mowin means Minago is that which is given to you, and Ijawin from somebody else. And it's your sacred knowledge bundle. And it's very holistic. It's the concept of multiple intelligences, spiritual, mental, physical, emotional, gifts that are given to you. It's your life experience. It's a very holistic way of thinking about what you offer to the world and what your gifts are. Typically, you introduce yourself with your title and your accreditations and your degrees, but this is a different way of talking about yourself. I want to acknowledge the land here, the traditional territories of the people, the first peoples of Turtle Island. I know City Council, I believe, has adopted that and acknowledges that really all land across Turtle Island, North America, is the traditional territories of some nation, whether it's Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, which is my nation, Ojibwe, we're quite large and have been through this area. And that land acknowledgement, the way that I introduced myself was actually my land acknowledgement, because when I say, Bojo and Dina Wamaganaduk, when I say greetings to you, all of my relatives, I'm not only speaking about the human beings, but I'm speaking about all of the relatives that are here, all of the ancestors, so the trees, the water, the plants, all of those are our relatives, the cedar trees out there, and so that's who I greet. That's the territory that I greet when I introduce myself in the language. And so I mentioned the path to discovery for knowledge is Deba Jimawin, so I'd like to cue up the video, and before I talk for a few minutes, I'd like you to watch this. It's called Anishinaabe Gikindaswin, and that means our original ways of knowing.
To know the land is to know the people, and to know the land is to remember what we were responsible for.
The origin story of trauma in our communities, it's so layered, the complexity around colonialism, around the Indian residential school and the legacy and the residue, the intergenerational trauma, and it's complex, the ways in which we got into this problem.
To be able to sit in this roundhouse, which has 9 sides for the 9 main clans in our community, and to look around and to see the ground that the ancestors walked on is still left uncovered, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful place to be.
For way too long, we've had, even well-meaning organizations or people controlling our programs and our processes. And we have capable Indigenous folks that can do that work.
I think Indigenous people have very profound thinking, which is, in my mind, very straightforward. We know how to be naturally sustainable, you know? We know how to be in relationship with all my relations.
I think some of the work that we're trying to do in Cree worldview would be Wakotuin, the way in which we govern ourselves, the way in which I'm in relation to you, the way I'm in relation to the land, to the water, to the spirit beings. You know, those are the ways in which we want to reclaim our children. In Sagituin, in love, that's embedded in our Nehiawak worldview. And so social innovation can be a tool that we can use in communities to talk about the words that have meanings for our families, so we can bring those back so that we can love together, live together, be in relation together, and live that good life together. Social innovation is a way to plant seeds of hope. And in those processes, it's really important that we bring back our language, that we bring back our culture and our ceremonies, because those are the ways in which we will heal. Those are the ways in which we nurture our spirits and nurture our ancestors and those children yet to come.
How do we come together and have the conversations about what our roles are and when are those roles appropriate? Or when do you take the lead? When do I take the lead? Because I do fundamentally believe we do need each other.
What we're hearing is that nobody has regalia, or their children don't have regalia, so there's a big push to make regalia for the community, and I think that's a really important step because it's, you know, helps with the identity piece. They can be proud of their heritage. And it's really hard when you're asking community too that have been so marginalized to, you know, show up and be present with really privileged people. So how do we keep them safe, right?
It's not easy creating a safe container, but we all have to agree when it's safe, we can actually start to look at the ugliness together, to heal it, to move forward.
It's really important that when we are in community, an Indigenous community, that it needs to be led by Indigenous folks. And we need to be making that space. And if there's not enough practitioners, then we need to be building that capacity.
So as funders, it's time to take a risk and provide opportunities for Indigenous folks to do the work that we need to do internally, so we can start to heal those wounds so that we can be healthy and thriving communities.
It all goes back to identity. Do I know who I am? Do I know where I'm from? And do I know where I'm going to and how I'm supposed to get there?
Chimikwich, thank you very much. That being able to take people back to my home territory, up to Kanachuanang, which is the Manitou Mounds, those are 10,000-year-old burial mounds, took a lot of convincing and a lot of years of work to convince funders, to convince the professors at Waterloo, supporters of the Institute, that the best place to go talk about and try to understand how to approach social innovation from an Indigenous perspective is to go closer, is to go back on the land. And it's difficult to do that when you don't have elders And so I needed to go home to where my elders are, where I'm from, back home in Treaty 3 territory. It's my grandmother's territory. And so the Gikindaswin's a project that we are doing with funding from the McConnell Foundation to, the Western term is decolonize social innovation labs, so change labs. Social innovation, you know, a definition, people are always asking, there's 700-800 different definitions for social innovation, but it's an initiative, product, or process, a program that profoundly changes the basic routines, resources, and authority flows or belief of any social system to which it is introduced. Another quote that I really like, that my colleague Otto Scharmer at the President Singh Institute in his book, Theory U, quotes Brian Arthur, who I believe was from Hanover Insurance, who said the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. I think that's really powerful because a lot of the work that I do is about healing. It's trauma-informed, and it's giving people opportunities to reflect back on their own Minagojawin, their own knowledge bundles. The teaching about the knowledge bundle is that it has an energy, and that energy results in commitment. So you have to cultivate it carefully. What are you putting in there? Are you putting land-based experiences and traditional teachings from my perspective? As an Anishinaabe Kwe, as an Indigenous woman, an Ojibwe woman, it's my responsibility to live life in balance, and we have teachings. So we have a medicine bundle or a knowledge bundle for Turtle Island Institute. That's the first thing the elders told us. They told us it was a teaching lodge. You know, in our name, we say Turtle Island Institute, because people know what that is. It's a think and do tank. Funders know what that is. But it's really a teaching lodge. And that's the important part, I think, of our work. 50% of my work is working in cross-cultural contexts with groups like NASA, for example, with their Earth Sciences Capacity Building Program. And then 50% is working in grassroots communities with Indigenous peoples, with Indigenous women, with Indigenous youth, elders. I do a lot of co-creating knowledge with elders, drawing on our Anishinaabe Gikindaswin, which is our worldviews, and Indamawin, our wisdom. And so the video shares a little bit about my journey, but I just wanted to go back to 2015, 2016, which was a transformative year for me personally. This is the year that I met Nancy, and she said, I think, it's probably a year before that actually, I was at a big NGO called the Canadian Red Cross. I was doing disaster response. I spent 7 years with them, 7 years, and 7 years before that I was with a tribal council called Anishinaabe Aski Nation, working on suicide prevention in remote communities. It represents 49 First Nations, 32 are remote fly-in. We have some of the highest suicide rates in the world. That's Treaty 9, that's my grandmother's community on my dad's side. And so going into disaster response, working with First Nations across the country, I started to learn about this concept of, you know, cross-cultural capacities that people should have, don't necessarily always have when working with First Nations communities. And it was the first time I think I was really introduced in a more profound way to the concept of philanthropy. And that's because the Red Cross is a big brand and has a lot of philanthropic support. And I would work with the philanthropy team, the lead team. And when I was with the provincial level, we raised $1.5 million for First Nations programming, and then I went up to the federal level, and just before I left, we had a single donor provide $2.8 million of investment in First Nations programming at the Red Cross. And then I discovered something called social innovation. And while I was at the Red Cross, Nancy was there at one of the events and heard me speak. And she invited me to speak at the International Women's Forum, IWF local chapter in Toronto. And based on that, I spoke at another event at Ryerson. And she said, I think you would be a fine candidate for the IWF fellowship program. And so I went through the application process. You write essays, and it's quite a journey to become an IWF fellow. It's a worthwhile journey. I was nominated by the local chapter in Toronto. It went to the Canadian chapter, then it went to Washington, and 35 women from 15 countries were selected that year. I was one of them, and I received the full scholarship for the tuition for that program, which is provided by IWF members, women, who pay their membership fees. That's $30,000 for 1 year to be in that program. It's sponsored by Harvard Business School and INSEAD, the business school of the world. And I also had a mentor in that program, and my mentor was a philanthropist, because I knew at that time I would be leaving that big NGO to start something, a social enterprise, to promote social innovation and introduce different people to a different way of doing social innovation. And so in 2015-16, I was also selected to the Getting to Maybe Social Innovation Residency Program at the Banff Center for Arts and the Peter Lougheed Institute for Leadership. That was a 30-day program. It was quite profound. We were learning social innovation. It was based on the graduate program at the Waterloo Institute for Social Innovation and Resilience, where I'm now a research fellow and in the final year, let's hope, of my doctoral program in social and ecological sustainability, where I study systems thinking and resilience thinking and complexity theory and the transformation of social ecological systems. And so I was in the Banff program, learning about social innovation. I was working full time, and then I was in the IWF fellowship program that year. So it was quite busy. I remember going to Boston like 4 times. And then I requested a mentor. You are assigned a mentor in that program, an IWF member. And I requested a philanthropist for a couple of reasons. One, because I wanted to learn more about philanthropy, and because I would be fundraising to support this institute called Turtle Island. And also because I thought that she would be able to introduce me to some leadership qualities. And she did. So my mentor was a woman named Ruth Ann Harnish from New York. She runs the Harnish Family Foundation, her and her husband. And their family foundation, I was given quite a bit of, I think, quite privileged access, because I spent a weekend with them at their house in the Hamptons. They live part-time in the Bahamas and part-time in the Hamptons. And she invited me down to New York City, and I spent time with her going to fundraisers. And fundraising in the US is a little bit different. You know, you have a breakfast, and every one of your lunch plates would have been $25,000, and that charity makes $500,000 with breakfast. And that's what we did. We went to She's the First, which was a charity set up for the first girl to go to school in her family. It was set up by a couple of women in their 20s, and we went to their fundraising breakfast in Manhattan, down on Wall Street. And then Ruth Ann sponsored me. So I'm just kind of telling you about some of the things that she did as a mentor that was a bit above and beyond. And quite frankly, I won the lottery when I asked for a philanthropist and got Ruth Ann. I was asked to do a TED Talk, for example, in Montreal, TED Women. And I didn't feel like I was ready, because a TED Talk is, you know, the message, the one idea worth spreading is sort of like the talk of your lifetime. And I'm not quite there yet. I think I'll be there maybe next year. And Ruth Ann said to me, I want you to decline that invitation. I said, but what if nobody ever asked me to do a TED Talk again? You know, I had spoken at an IWF conference in Montreal, and the curator for TEDx Women said, you know, we want you to come do a talk. And she asked me to reply to that response and CC her so that I would have the courage to decline a TED Talk. And I did. And she said, you know what, instead I'm going to take you to TED Women. Go to the original TED. And she sponsored me to go to TED Women in San Francisco in 2016, where I met all kinds of wonderful people. I met an architect named Jean Gang of Gang Studios. She's a MacArthur Fellow. And I'm mentioning her because I talk about her when I talk about social innovation. She's taken principles of Indigenous knowledge, the way our traditional structures were around the world, which promoted families, extended families, dialogues and conversations, not like our modern houses with bedrooms and everybody just goes and closes their door. And she's redesigned police stations, and those police stations that she's redesigned, one in Chicago, she designed it to be a hub of the community instead of a big fortress where everybody's afraid to go. And it had an impact on crime rates and police brutality. And so innovation isn't necessarily about new. It can be. It can be inventions, it could be a new idea, it could be a technological invention. But some of the best social innovations are people looking at things in a more holistic way, applying systems thinking. Systems thinking is like the iceberg model, if you're familiar with that. You know, we often look at symptoms, and then we engage in something called shifting the burden. Shifting the burden is a system archetype. My colleague Peter Senge, if you've read The Fifth Discipline, talks about all these system archetypes. And shifting the burden is short-term solutions. right? More homeless shelters. But homeless shelters, while demonstrating empathy, does not actually address homelessness. So what makes people at risk to homelessness? Lots of things. I mean, lack of income, for one, but many other things. And so what shifting the burden does, though, is it allows us to feel a little bit better because we're going to fund a whole bunch of homeless shelters. But the side effect of that, and this gets mapped out, I'm a bit of a geek for all the systems maps and mapping, but it gets mapped out, and the side effect of that is essentially we start to think that we've solved homelessness because we don't see them anymore, right? They're not on the street. And then we shift our attention, that's why it's called shifting the burden, we shift our attention away from fundamental solutions to problems. That's why I love social innovation. Because I worked on climate change, disaster response. I've worked in my career on entrepreneurship for Aboriginal Business Canada years ago. I was a funder. And I worked on the suicide crisis in the northern communities. And a colleague of mine from the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, they got a donation from the Bush Foundation, which is in South Dakota. And it was for several $1 million to address poverty, to, the levels of poverty on that reservation. And after she heard me talk once, she said, I wish I knew about systems thinking, because what we did were a whole bunch of pilot projects and a whole bunch of programs. But we didn't really look at the underlying deep-rooted causes of poverty. Poverty in Indigenous communities, of course, the underlying deep-rooted causes is colonization, theft of land, lack of access to resources, lack of access to capital. In Canada, we have the Indian Act, right? We could go through like the whole history of colonization, but suffice it to say that it is often at the bottom of that iceberg, whatever we're looking at within Indigenous communities. And so I decided that I would build a social enterprise. So I got to learn a lot from Ruth Ann. She also sent me to op-ed training, Katie Orenstein's organization. 90% of op-ed pieces in major newspapers in the States were written by white men. And she looked at that and said, that can't be good. That's what everybody's reading in these op-ed pieces. And so she started op-ed. It's a nonprofit organization that teaches women, particularly women of color, women who don't have voices. They're taught by professional journalists with mentorship, which is wonderful. So you can actually write your op-ed piece and then send it off to a journalist who helps you rewrite it, right? Because often people will quote, oh, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times, there was an op-ed piece in the Globe and Mail, and people will quote that. Those are thought leaders. And so the op-ed training was done at Wellesley College in Boston. And in that year, I decided to leave the Red Cross, take a chance. I didn't have a job, but I had 6 months of funding for Turtle Island Institute. I just jumped in. Fortunately, we've had funders come forward that are helping us. The McConnell Family Foundation, the Suncor Energy Foundation are supporters of emergence. And so one of the system dynamics of complex systems is that they're nonlinear and they are emergent. So you can't sort of look at it from a typical funding strategy of what are you going to do, what are your key performance indicators, what are your outcomes, what are your measurables, what are your metrics. I basically build relationships with funders, and we start to co-create ideas together, and then I say, if you have capital, do you want to fund this? And they'll say yes. So hopefully they'll say yes. It's a bit presumptuous of me, but hopefully they'll say yes because we have a relationship. Huh? Optimistic, yes. But it's also because we have a relationship. And sometimes that starts with me working with their teams. And so I wrote an article for the McConnell Foundation. It was published in the Philanthropist this year. And it was about decolonizing philanthropy. And I quoted Villanueva's book of that title, Decolonizing Philanthropy. And I actually, at that time, I was sort of looking at, there was an announcement of the Schwartz and Reisman, or Reisman Foundation, the Indigo chapters. Her company is the bookstores. Heather's Picks, when you go to your local, but that's Heather. So they donated $100 million to the University of Toronto for an AI innovation hub, a big building, to look at, keeping Canada up with the technology of AI. And I said in that article, what if some philanthropists got together and donated $100 million to an Indigenous Innovation Fund with Indigenous people governing it so that it was also an act of empowerment and its reparations? Because how many of these big foundations, including the foundations that fund me, have made money off resource extraction and resources from traditional lands and from stolen lands and the theft of lands and the whole history of capitalism and colonization? And so it's reparations. And that article was well received in the community. Just before it, though, I spoke at an event, the Canadian Environmental Grantmakers Network, CEGN. I spoke there this spring. 65 granting organizations, all donors. And I was telling folks at my table at lunch that I had prepared sort of a talk about climate change. And then I saw a keynote speaker on the second day not be well received because these are climate change experts. These are funders who have studied this and thought about it. So I rewrote my entire presentation to focus on philanthropy. And it was photographs. I had 45 slides of photographs of doing work on the land because we didn't have that video yet. And at the end of it, I mentioned who my funders are, including a resource extraction company, a big oil company, the Suncor Energy Foundation. I said, but systems thinkers, that is what we do. We work with the folks that you might say, that's my enemy, right? The politician that's standing in the way. That's what social innovation labs are. You have to have people participating from across the system, and you need to be able to hold those dialogues and those conversations. That's that building the container that they talked about in the video. And so I've been specializing in an approach to build a container based on Indigenous ways of doing things. So I talk about BAU a lot, business as usual. Business as usual is how we typically do things. In an event like this, sitting at tables, not out on the land, not sitting in circle. This is what we're accustomed to. It's very hegemonic. So I do little things, I tweak things. I call them Indigenous design principles. And so for an example, I was asked to work with the Engineering Change Lab, which is a social innovation lab in Canada that's looking at the profession of engineering and shifting that profession to be in service of humanity, in service of, the continuation of life on this planet. And they've landed on something called technological stewardship. So I did a 40-minute talk with them, and I said, your definition, though, just like the Brundtland Commission, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Brundtland Commission on Sustainability, is very anthropocentric. It has a bias towards humanity, towards human beings as the center of the universe. What if you were saving the planet for them, for those relatives out there? There's a different mindset. And so I had an opportunity, I gave a keynote address at the Stockholm Resilience Center, where the theory of planetary boundaries came out of, all those finite resources that we have, the Anthropocene. And I said, it worries me that you brilliant client, you're so brilliant, these climate scientists, and I had 7 minutes to say this, you're quite brilliant, but you haven't shifted your mindset to fall in love with her, Mother Earth, and to go out on the land and be with her and to understand what those rivers are doing, because everything you need as a human being to sustain your life is provided by her, right? We create these things, we build these environments, but everything you need is there. And so what I do is I've designed programs and opportunities. I guess you could say I curate opportunities for people to be on the land in ceremony, to hear about our languages. And I'm going to wrap up. I think I've got about 3 minutes. I've got an extra 5, thanks. And so what I've done is I've kind of curated opportunities for people from diverse backgrounds to engage with Indigenous communities in an ethical way, what Cree scholar Willie Ermine called ethical space. That's, if we're on a bench, the space between us can't be about power dynamics. You can't come into that as a privileged person or as the professor and the student, You can have a master and a grasshopper, but really you're sitting in circle. And that's one of the design principles, is that we're often sitting in circle. So I brought that Engineering Change Lab. When I spoke to them and I asked them about their definition, technological stewardship is technology for the betterment of all. I said, who's all? That was a blind spot. And that's a recurring blind spot I've seen in social innovation, which is the anthropocentric bias, the bias towards humanity. And then there's all kinds of other intersectional lenses on that, who are humans, there's gendered lenses, there's, all kinds of different people who are marginalized that don't make it into those conversations and are not necessarily at the table. Social innovation is very privileged and very white in Canada. I'm often the only brown person or Black, Indigenous person of color, BIPOC person at social innovation events in Canada. And so we're redesigning the Getting to Maybe Social Innovation Residency at the Banff Centre. It's the first time the Banff Centre is partnering with an external organization, and it's Turtle Island Institute. And so we have a 12-day residency starting in May of 2020 that's going to invite BIPOC people, and it's going to be land-based. Because I asked the Banff Centre, who, if you've never been there, is quite beautiful. Banff is quite beautiful, and the Banff Centre that's traditional Stoney Nakoda and Blackfoot territories. And I said, what if that mountain, that sacred mountain, Sleeping Buffalo Mountain, was the greatest teacher in this program, instead of the brilliant, faculty and facilitators that are involved? And they started to think about that, and I said, that's what Turtle Island could do, because I work with elders who always remind me when I start to be far away from our teachings and from the land. And so we're partnering with the Banff Centre for the Getting to Maybe residency. In my intro, there was a whole bunch of other projects listed, but I wanted to share with you this idea that getting connected to the land and understanding Anishinaabe, Gikindasuin, and Indamawin, our wisdoms and our knowledge, is that just for Anishinaabe people? Is that just for Indigenous peoples? And I would argue that it's not. That in my experience, people around the world are looking for a connection to the land again. We've become so disconnected from our food, from our sources of medicine. There are little bottles, at a pharmacy. The biomedical model, talking about health this morning, we have a teaching, the medicine wheel, the spiritual, mental, physical, emotional. It's not the absence of disease, it's the presence of balance, which I think is what the healthcare model, Western model, is looking at now, right? Epidemiologists and public health started to look at, why are you having a heart attack? It might be heart disease, but it might also be spiritual, emotional, right? Stress. And so our elders knew that and treated people that way. That's how they ask you questions when you go into our lodges, our Mamadasawin, our sweat lodges, where my aunties and uncles and family doctor people. And I'm a Shkawabis there, so I help. So I have the fortune in my medicine bundle, my Mitagojawin, of having university education, having fellowship programs, but also having the culture, the Anishinaabe, Gikindasuin, that I've cultivated since I was about 13 years old to go back and learn those teachings. And I have some evidence that the world is looking for it. So I spent the past 7 days, Nancy mentioned, at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which, by the way, is the traditional people, the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. And I was there with my colleagues Otto Scharmer, Kelvie Bird, and Peter Senge. And we recorded a webinar a few days ago, and the webinar was called The Civilizational Shift from Ego to Eco, which is Otto's terminology, from egocentric thinking to eco-centric thinking. And his framework is based on the idea that, we all know what a smartphone is. When you're working within a system, he uses the metaphor of an app. Right? You don't fundamentally change the phone if you just add another app. But working on the system, that iceberg model, those deep-rooted problems, avoiding the system trap of shifting the burden, requires a civilizational level shift from ego to eco. And so he goes down, he's got a chart, and there's a number of systems, so the healthcare system, governance, education, food, and finance. And he talks about 1.0 down to 4.0, so 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I was at the Executive Champions Workshop with Otto and Peter and Arawana Nyashi in Stowe, Vermont this spring, where I first saw that framework that Otto created. And I looked at that 4.0, and we're sitting in the Green Mountains at Trapp Family Lodge, which was a bit lost on me. I hadn't seen The Sound of Music. Now I have. Now I know who the Trapp family is. So the Trapp Family Lodge, and we were under a tent, surrounded by mountains and birch trees. It was beautiful. I love that Peter and Otto and Arawana do that work there with the Society for Organizational Learning. So there were 45 people there, executives from around the world, sitting on the land. And it was the first time that they did ceremony, because I brought my medicine bundle and smudged and passed around the eagle feather. Billionaires from Taiwan, were smudging. It was beautiful. And we had that teaching from Otto. And I looked at 4.0 and I kind of said to him, you know, that's what we had before contact. That's how we did education. So in education, he talks about transformative learning experiences, right? Versus 1.0, the schoolhouse and the model we have now, the factory, you know, testing, things like that. And in our health, cultivating sources of well-being. I said, that's what we did. We didn't have this model of, you know, the absence of disease. And then he talked about governance, and of course I talked about the Wampum Belts and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Abenaki Confederacy and the Blackfoot Confederacy and our clan systems and matriarchal structures where clan mothers in the Haudenosaunee teachings picked the leaders. And their legislation was natural law. Those principles of reciprocity with the earth and that you're all related, those were our natural laws. And the elders now say that's the legislation. So man-made law is not what's going to help us anymore. Us Indigenous is to go back to our ways. So that's why in Turtle Island we talk about reawakening. And so I'm just going to wrap up by saying we were at this, we were filming or recording a webinar, and it sold out instantly. It was announced on like last Friday, just over a week ago it was announced, and I didn't even get to tweet it out. It was sold out, which was wonderful. And we filmed it on Tuesday, and 500 people from 56 countries on 7 continents showed up. Thank you. To hear me give a little bit of this talk, to hear me talk about Minagojawin with Otto Scharmer and Peter Senge, who in my field are the world-leading systems thinkers. They are, and I also study with another one, Frances Wesley, at the University of Waterloo, and that was her definition I shared with you at the beginning of my talk. Frances Wesley wrote a book called Getting to Maybe, and that means we may not get to the absolute perfect destination, because innovation is always happening. It's always recycling in cycles. It's getting to maybe that's important. And that's what the program that we run at the Banff Center is called, Getting to Maybe. So I'm going to wrap it up there and just say that people are seeking profound connections to the land through ceremonies, through language, through wisdom. Our language is verb-based. It's not noun-based. She, Mother Earth, is not an it or a thing or a resource or a commodity. She's my mom, my relative. And because she's my relative, I have a profound connection because all of my knowledge comes from her. And for us, knowledge isn't in your head, so it's not intellectual for us. It resides on the land and it's experienced on the land. It's revealed to you in revelation, dreams, visions, and teachings that happen on the land. So we build a lot of solos into the work we do so people can go out on the land and get those teachings that they feel quite disconnected from. And I will do my final bit of, you know, why I'm here also, is we're seeking donors. We have funding, but we're seeking partners more than donors. I'm working with the MasterCard Foundation right now, the TD Friends of the Environment, and I haven't given them an ask. They've asked me if I have an ask, and I said, I need to know what you're all about, because I need to be in ethical relationships. And I have an ethical relationship with McConnell and with the Suncor Energy Foundation because they have spent a lot of time with me. When I think out loud with them about what we could potentially do with something like you know, a Social Innovation Institute. So that's based on a relationship. And so that, I think, is the key to decolonizing philanthropy is relationship-based philanthropy. So thank you for listening, and thank you, Nancy, so much for thinking of me and inviting me.
With the purse. Come on out here. There we go. We're getting our picture taken with the purse, and anybody can step up and have their picture taken too. Anyway, I'm so proud of Mulaney because really, she just keeps on going higher and higher and higher and higher, and she's so low-key the whole time. When I invited her to come and speak at the breakfast, you know, she knew it was a bunch of high-powered women, and so she gets kind of dressed up in her corporate and her heels. And then she gets there, and they're friendly people, and she says to me, "Do you mind if I take these shoes off?" No, not at all. But this is what happened with IWF. Through the Fellows Program, there's a tremendous amount of learning, but through that process, you meet more people and you meet more people and you just keep on going. So, you know, empowerment really, really, really makes a difference in the world. So empower everybody you possibly can. I know everybody's tired. It is the end of the day. I have everybody's email address. But before you go, I want you to go into the right because we have butter tarts and date squares for a little sugar fix. If you can't stay and enjoy one, please take one with you. And Jeff and I are already scheming about doing a little Banff Center event locally, depending on your schedule, and it will definitely be outdoors. And we won't have to get dressed up. It'll be casual. It'll be lots of fun. It'll just build on everything we've done today. The only ask that I will leave with each of you is think of 30 or 40 something that you can bring to the next event, because we do want younger people and even bring grandchildren. We'll find some way to accommodate them as well. So end of the day, thank you so much for coming. It was a great day and I'm delighted you were all present.